Right. Hello, everyone. And we are going to start our next panel, Sex and Authority. We have 5 panelists in total who will speak. 2 of them are via Skype. So if we can, And 2 things to tell you about before we start, before I introduce our panelists. Please feel free to use the Twitter hashtag QueerAsia 2017 and ask people to and use the tag at QueerAsia 2017 in your tweets. I have no idea how Twitter works, so right. And there has been a change to the program, and we are going to start with Rajorshi Das. So Rajorshi is an M.Phil student at the University of Delhi, India. And he's also a research scholar and a poet that's trying to make sense of the contradictions and viability of intersectional politics. And his paper is called Nationalism and Queer Intersectionality in Aubrey, Menen. So, for you. And whenever you want me to click, just tell me to click.
Yeah, so am I good to go?
Yes.
Yeah. So as you've already mentioned the title of the paper, I just go right away into the introduction. Can you play the second slide, please? So the introduction is titled Menen as Queer Diasporic Subject. While the term diaspora can be traced back to the Greek word diasporin, which means to scatter, and was originally used to refer to the forced displacement of the Jewish and the Greek communities from their homelands, the usage of the term queer as a political category is more recent, and it can be attributed to the 1990 Queer Nation Manifesto. Since the diaspora often seeks allegiance from the land of origin and tries to perpetuate or recover traditions, real and imaginary, it often tends to breed intolerance towards sexual minorities who are seen as aberrations. Queering the diaspora therefore seems like an impossible task steeped in contradictions. In Impossible Desires, Gayatri Gopinath treats queer as a category that can trouble, I quote, the nationalist ideologies of the Indian diaspora fully aligned with the interests of transnational capitalism, unquote. She adds that suturing queer to diaspora thus recuperates those desires, practices, and subjectivities that are rendered impossible and unimaginable within conventional diasporic and nationalist imaginaries. Gopinath's use of the term suture indicates that the queer body can redeem or heal the diaspora from its overt dependence on heteronormative and gender binaries. While the contemporary discourse on gay and lesbian rights has taken a homonationalist turn, assimilating the sexual minorities into mainstream cultures, Aubrey Menen, an Indo-Irish author writing in the middle of the 20th century, makes a deliberate attempt to speak from the margins as an out homosexual whose mixed ethnicity engenders him to expose the hypocrisy of the empire. The queer anger that the manifesto appeals to in a later section is channelized in Menen's case through dark humor and satire against forms of institutionalized violence. In Brahma Retold, the satiric retelling of the Indian epic, he remarks, I quote, "There are 3 things which are real: God, human folly, and laughter." While Menen manages to seek alliances across time and space is evident from his empathy with Valmiki, the author of Ramayana, he does not locate his sexual identity within any national border. Rather, he negotiates multiple boundaries to prove the hollowness of such territorial aspirations that encourage colonization and other forms of state-sponsored violence. Can I have the next slide, please? The next section is titled Queer Home and Childhood Trauma. Now, we know that the queer home often tries to deconstruct the idea of the familial home as a place of comfort and belonging. Menen's otherwise sarcastic description of how his mother decided to bring up an Indo-Irish child as an Englishman is problematized by instances of racism. And I'm just going to skip a few sections here, which basically refers to how initially he was, given pennies on street by these gentlemen, but later mistaken for a Turk because of his brown complexion. Menen mocks his privileged status as an Englishman that allows him to treat both the Irish and the Indians as his inferiors, as long as he was careful to speak of them as at their face as his equals. Though largely co-opted by the British society, Menen is repeatedly made conscious of his Eurasian identity, a mixed ethnic category also known as half-castes and later reframed as Anglo-Indians. Neela Gandhi notes that after Darwin, I quote, the colluding discourses of evolutionary anthropology and psychology hermetically sealed the frontiers of civilized community, only admitting certain forms of human alliance. Though the empire was aware of the sexual proclivities of its men, it was reluctant to recognize what it saw as illegitimate and disposable products of interracial relationships that became a taboo in the 19th century. Sexuality becomes central to the working of the empire, as evident from Menen's reference to the irrepressible sexual desire for dark skins that would be enough to ruin any British official serving in the subcontinent. Being born in Britain, Menen avoids the fates of Eurasians in India. However, his ethnicity haunts him later in life when at University College London, he is denied the Rosa Morrison bursary for not being of pure English descent. I'll now move on to the next section. You can play the next slide, please. Which is titled Anti-Colonialism and Nationalism. And it begins with a brief quotations from Colonialism and Homosexuality by Robert Aldrich, where he says that these two categories work together and are complicit, therefore the homosexual is complicit within the imperial order. However, this equation was bound to be upset with the proliferation of the sexological discourses in the late 19th century, that led to the construction of the homosexual subject not just as a medical condition, but a species altogether, as Foucault says. With the advent of the evolutionary theory of Darwin, the homosexual was not only denied entry into the cisgender universe, but also designated as a traitor to the cause of nation building due to his inability to procreate and be part of the institutions of family and marriage. Since sexual difference became markers of degeneracy and savagery, also associated with the colonized, the homosexual felt an urgent need to seek a, I quote, radical form of kinship or a horizontal level of friendship, as Neela Gandhi points out. The formation of this grand intersectional alliance can also be traced back to the cosmopolitanism of London that housed critiques of empire who were able to resist the factory of making imperialist-minded citizens. Neela Gandhi reads Edward Carpenter's homosexual politics less in terms of actual dissident sexual acts and more as, I quote, radical reconfiguration of association, alliance, relationality, and community. This minority consciousness takes a universal worldview in the case of Aubrey Menen, whose sexuality becomes a subtext in his critique of racial pride and culture. His prologue to Dead Man in the Silver Market begins with a dismissal of several theories on ethnic superiority ranging from natural selection to a more insidious will of God. As against Carpenter and E.M. Foster, Menen's queer subjectivity empowers him not to restrict his critique of race and nationalism to Britain. In a scathing attack on white supremacy, he exposes the complicity of other superpowers in ideas of racial purity that culminated in the Holocaust. In Straight Mind and other essays, Monique Wittig writes that a text by a minority writer is effective only if it succeeds in making the minority point of view universal. The need to universalize one's minority position can be read as a precursor to queer intersectionality, where forging alliance does not necessarily obfuscate one's specific identity. Not being restricted to any country, Menen's comment on nationalism can be read as a conscious attempt to universalize his ethnic subject position. And you can read it from this slide. I'm not going to read the quotation. Menen's account emphasizes the nature of nationalism as a destructive ideology that culminates into violence against foreigners, a label not just restricted to non-state subjects, but any individual or group that does not look or behave national enough. Nationalism therefore has to be performed as a compulsory exercise, as evident in the recent controversies in India over the slogan of Bharat Mata Ki Jai, that is, all hail Mother India. While the national is usually a homogeneous category, the anti-national can be constructed out of a sense of an imaginary threat from any community or individuals from the margins that refuse to engage in this performance. Menen, however, vehemently distinguishes it from patriotism, and in doing so recognizes the country as being capable of producing genuine patriots. Menen's critique of nationalism has an eerie similarity with that of Rabindranath Tagore, his literary predecessor. And can you please play the next slide? And you can see there's a brief quotation there from Tagore's Nationalism. While Tagore associates nationalism with the West, Menen reads it as a decayed form of patriotism. Both agree that the empire has influenced notions of nationality in its colonies, resulting in acts of mimicry. Menen uses the story of Jibaro Indians who are, I quote, devoted to the national task of cutting off the organs of generations of male enemies to illustrate the delusion of the English who cherish the treasures looted from the colonies. He critiques Western civilization in The Space Within the Heart, where he refers to the tribal community of Dangis. I quote, I was there to bring civilization to them. Had they dropped bombs on my parents? Had they driven Norbert out of his country and his life? Norbert was a Jew who was driven out of Germany. In his shortest chapter, The Dead Man in the Silver Market, set in Old Delhi during World War II, Menen provides a moving account of a public murder perpetrated by a British soldier in the name of law and order. And again, please refer to the quotation, the extract in the slide. The detailed description of the Indians' death is not just an indictment on British imperialism, but shows the detachment of the Indian national leaders from the disillusioned working class. Surprisingly, Menen displays casual ignorance about shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder, epitomized by Septimus' character in Virginia versus Mrs. Dalloway. He attributes the aged man's momentary insanity to the frequent inability of Indians to deal with excitement. In doing so, he perpetuates a colonial stereotype that saw the colonized as weak, hysterical, and effeminate. Menen fails to link insanity to a post-war condition that affected not only communists but also British soldiers in the aftermath of the world wars. Since sanity becomes a privilege in times of war and violence, like Wolfe's Septimus, the Indian takes refuge in death, shattering all notions of Gandhian endurance and stoicism. I'll move on to the next section of my presentation. Can you please play the next slide? It's called Nair Hegemony and Caste. Excuse me. A stranger with a keen sense of awareness of both culture, Menen was able to reject the idea of home as a place of security and belonging. In a chapter titled My Grandmother and the Dirty English, he provides a mock heroic portrait of his Nair grandmother. I quote, she rarely spoke to anyone who was not of her social station, and she received them formally, that is to say, with her breasts completely bare. Menen here mocks Victorian ideas of prudery and covering by revealing the formality of being bare-breasted within the Nair community. In British India, the Nair woman's body became a site of resistance against modernity and colonization. In the absence of a marriage law, the Nair women were free to forge or break relationships with Nambudri Brahmins or men from their own community. G. Arunima notes that while both men and women were promiscuous, but what shocked the European mind was the absence of chastity and shame in Nair women. Linstoten, a 17th century Dutch traveler to Malabar, describes the Nair as the most lecherous and unchaste nation in all Orient. His use of the term nation to describe the community may suggest a subnational identity even prior to the advent of modernity. Menen's grandmother's reference to her racial superiority reveal a sense of nostalgia for a supposedly pristine Nair past and the desire to forge a nation on that basis. She dismisses the English as dirty and backward, expressing shock over the latter societal customs, particularly with respect to personal cleanliness, marriage, and remarriage. Menen breaks the binary of East and West by highlighting how such feelings are mutual. He, however, fails to recognize that the former, that is the Nair community, uses its notion of cultural superiority as the only form of resistance against the mighty empire and espouses a legitimate claim for freedom. Menen's caricature of his paternal grandmother is a systematic attack on Nair hegemony, and as Graham Hall, his partner, mentions in the introduction, he was always at his best when attacking sacred cows. The Nairs, along with the Syrian Christians and Brahmins, were the most powerful and rich sections of early 19th century Keralite society. Menen's grandmother's dismissal of his Irish daughter-in-law as an English woman must not be read in terms of the former's sub-nationalist opposition to colonial power, but as a casteist fear of pollution. As a representative of Nair tradition, she seems unmoved by the anti-caste left discourse emerging in early 19th century Kerala. While the casteist cosmopolitan would welcome foreigners, I quote J. Devika here, only insofar as they would integrate within the hierarchical framework of caste society, Menen's grandmother denies Alice that opportunity since her marriage to her son violates the very norms of endogamy that are crucial to perpetuate caste differences. Menen's critique of caste is more pertinent in Rama Retold, where he accuses the Brahmins of distorting the writing of Valmiki, whom he sees as an ally. I quote, "Generation of Brahmins have rewritten his poems so that in parts it says the opposite of what Valmiki plainly intended. I shall aim at reviving this attitude of mine," unquote. This text was, however, banned during the time of Jawaharlal Nehru, and one of the first texts, in fact, to be banned in independent India. I would like you to move on to the next slide because it's there's a reference to this there. And of course, the text was seen as an attack on Hinduism and the very tenets of Indian nationalism that celebrated the hallowed figures of Rama and Sita. I conclude now, and you can move on to the last slide. According to Tuan, hometown is an intimate place. Its ugliness does not matter. However, in Menen, this intimacy leads to an exposure of the violent underpinnings of the familial and familiar national and subnational cultures. While he distances himself from any political idea, including that of communism, his critique of all forms of authority makes his works the earliest examples of queer writings in post-colonial India. One, however, has to be wary of co-opting Menen into any politics, and my effort to queer him is not without its complexities. As he writes, anticipating inquisitive scholars like me, I quote, "But very soon there would be people who would discover that they owed one half of their genes to a totally unknown man masturbating into a hospital test tube. Such persons, I felt, would have a far more urgent need to find their true selves even than myself." Thank you.
Right. I don't know how short notice it is, but if we can do something about the sound, it would be ideal. Anyway, let's move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ismail Shogo. Ismail is a research assistant at the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. His research looks at state behavior, resistance movements, and gender in the Middle East and Africa. And the title of his paper is Resistance from the Closet, Queer Politics in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'll do that.
Thank you so much, Siodhbhra, for that very nice introduction. Of course, from the title of my paper, you can tell that my paper is on Saudi Arabia, and the inception of my paper actually began when I started following the news of the Arab Spring, following which discourse on authoritarian resilience and stability in the Middle East had gained significant traction. While the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia proved to stand through the virulent period seemingly unscathed, its survival had not come without resistance from marginalized groups, including political activists, women, and the lesser discussed LGBT group. My paper, therefore, will explore the regime's instrumentalization of queer narratives and themes as a means of consolidating legitimacy and control in the Saudi kingdom. By analyzing the socio-political landscape of Saudi Arabia through particularly LGBT resistance, I argue that analysis that have grounded the kingdom's aversion to homosexuality on grounds of religious ideology alone as imprecise, or at best incomplete. Instead, this dynamic must be analyzed within a larger, more political framework that is the legitimacy blueprint of the Al-Saud regime. On the 27th of March 2017, a man in Saudi Arabia was arrested by the religious police for publicly displaying a rainbow pride flag above his home in Jeddah. While the man subsequently claimed to be unaware of the symbolism that underpinned the flag, the arrest, like many others of a similar nature, had been framed as an aversion to Islam, the state religion of the Saudi kingdom. The kingdom has also, in response to currents of modernity, sought to broaden its legitimacy vehicle by extending religion beyond just state religion alone to that of Saudi national identity as a means of uniting the various fissures that have come to grown within Saudi society. This Islamic national identity has functioned as both a unifying instrument and a source of political legitimacy for the ruling dynasty, a reality to which the reign of the Al-Saud regime the past 2.5 centuries would attest to. For decades, Al-Saud and its conservative associates have expressed their aversion to homosexuality in the language of Islam. In March 2014, the head of the Consultative Assembly of Saudi Arabia, Sheikh Saleh bin Humaid, presented a sermon at the Grand Mosque in Mecca that alluded to homosexuality as a malady that, quote-unquote, seeks to strip man of his humanity and violates the sanctity of Allah. Again in 2015, the Saudi Foreign Minister Abdel Al-Jubair insisted on the removal of the gay rights from the UN list of Sustainable Development Goals on grounds of being counter to Islamic law. In addition to harsh laws, the regime has also imposed significant limitations on what it calls blasphemous and immoral content, including that pertains to the LGBT community. This has created a perception of a very religious kingdom that is very much averse to any form of homosexual behavior, and one that has stripped the LGBT community completely of any agency. However, from what I have found, an analysis of resistance, albeit minimal, held by individuals who engage in homosexual behavior in Saudi Arabia, one might come to realize that such forms of narratives may not necessarily hold water. It is imperative, however, at this junction to redefine what is ought to be meant as resistance within the Saudi socio-political narrative. Given that homosexuality manifests not as an identity in Saudi Arabia as it is in the West, it would be problematic to simply delineate resistance as one that entails demands for acknowledgements for rights, as often mirrored by pride marches and the like in the Western world. Evidently, theoretical basis for homosexuality in Saudi Arabia, like much of the Arab world, continue to allude to very old Foucauldian concepts of sexuality that have sought to separate sexual behavior from sexual identity. What this means to say is that being homosexual need not necessarily exist within the Saudi understanding of homosexuality. It is within this regard, therefore, that analysis of queer resistance, I argue, must start from observation of deviance from Saudi law. In this sense, deviance, that is engagement in homosexual ideas or themes within closeted domains that is reached neither by Sharia nor the religious police, hence the title of my paper. One very popular mode of deviance, as the previous panel has also touched on, would be through the use of applications that culminate often in same-sex, albeit not always sexual, rendezvous. Ethnographic accounts of same-sex related behavior in Saudi Arabia have conspicuously highlighted the inhibited expressions of homosexual behavior in Saudi Arabia, with communities of men and women who engage in this behavior to be found in cities like Jeddah and Riyadh. As one account notes, as long as gays and lesbians maintain a public front of obedience to Wahhabi Islamic norms, the kingdom leaves considerable space for homosexual behavior. One man went as far as to calling Riyadh, the Saudi capital, a gay heaven. Strictly enforced segregation laws between the sexes have also lent to the prevalence of these modes of same-sex rendezvous. As one woman had claimed, it is easier to be lesbian than a heterosexual in Saudi Arabia. These forms of Saudi deviant social dispositions, however, cannot be interpreted, I argue, as mere trivial self-indulgence, but rather a collective phenomenon that lends eventually to the creation of a Saudi gay culture. This Saudi gay culture, albeit decentralized and organically formed, forms the basis of a new underground space within Saudi society that allows for new normatives of sexuality and sexual engagement to flourish and operate within a society and a state that is so oppressive and repressive. The second, more interesting mode of deviance, you can find it within lesbian fiction, Saudi fiction, novels authored under pseudonyms like Siba al-Hirs, the others, known in Arabic as al-Akhrun, explore themes like lesbian romance and themes. These books, of course, have already been banned from the kingdom. And let me just explain one of the So in one of the pages, as you can see on the second top right, it says, this is an exploration of a sexuality, one that is very much taboo in Saudi Arabia. When I typed in the English words homosexual and bisexual, the pages that came up made my head hurt. I felt as though they were forcing upon me an awareness and acknowledgement of an orientation that was not really mine. And yet the pages that came up on the screen, when I searched for the Arabic equivalent, al-mithliya al-jinsiyya, all weird from tahrim to tajrim, interdiction to criminalization. Evidently, these platforms, such as Saudi fiction that have been protected from Sharia and the Mutsawin, serve as a form of cultural warfare against state-led narratives of homosexuality. The prevalence of existing forms of resistance, however, cannot be understood as mere inadequacies of law enforcement. Instead, more often than not, evidence has suggested a deliberate nonchalance on part of Saudi authorities with respect to policing homosexual behavior. Incidentally, there have been no executions for homosexuality, despite what the law contends, for years in the Saudi kingdom, with the last execution dating back to January 2002. This remains so, despite the fact a Saudi diplomat in Washington having had confirmed that sodomy, his words, not mine, remains prevalent among consenting males on a daily basis. Admitting to the fact that even the head of the religious police having had known of the acknowledgement of a Saudi gay population in Saudi Arabia. this disconnect between rhetoric and enforcement is telling of the regime's opinion on LGBT issues. It is evidently within the understanding of homosexuality rather than a constituent of a person's identity, but rather one that pertains more to practice that has foreclosed this phenomenon as a threat against this Islamic Saudi national identity. Because homosexuality is perceived not as a static attribute of the individual Saudi identity, the state has little to no problems in reconciling homosexual behavior with the greater Islamic identity of the Saudi state. Homosexual behavior is understood therefore as innocuous, non-political deviations that, when conducted within private domains, and this is a very important caveat, do not threaten the Saudi monarchy. This phenomenon unveils the politicization of LGBT themes within the larger legitimacy campaign of the regime. Saudi Arabia's exaggerated rhetoric demonizes homosexuality as well as make invisible the sexual minorities in the kingdom, therefore continues to merely uphold and perpetuate the illusion of a united Islamic state. Recently, however, during the Arab Spring, there has been a new mode of resistance by many activists in the Saudi kingdom, and this has shifted, from one that is just deviance alone to resistance that entails demands for rights and equalities, while all within a new closet, the secure confines of the online space. On Twitter alone, multiple activists such as Saudi Arabia LGBT, Saudi LGBT have garnered large followings in advocating for recognition and equality for the LGBT community. A significant portion of these accounts came to surface during the Arab Spring when notions of democracy and human rights came to become very prevalent in the Arab world. It is necessary, however, to realize that these accounts are not mere inane rantings by disenfranchised pure Saudis, but instead premeditated platforms aimed at creating political change. One account specifically, as you can see over there, conveyed in a tweet. This is not a personal Twitter account. It was put up exclusively for promoting LGBT awareness in Saudi Arabia. Since their inception, these users have continued to advocate for change in the Saudi kingdom. In April 2016, the Saudi gay urged for the change in the colloquial term used in the kingdom that refers to gays from shudhuth, which means anomaly, to mithlin, that is homosexual. The hashtag sanahakum hukuk al-mithlin, real respect LGBT rights, also went viral in the Middle East, suggesting that a huge portion of the tweets came from Saudi Arabia. What my paper essentially intends on showing is that, contrary to popular belief, it is not within religion alone that would seek to explain the kingdom's aversion to homosexuality, but rather it is politics. And evidently, as these forms of resistance exemplify, the existence of these forms of resistance exemplify, it is the survivability of the monarchy and its power as the head of the state that would seek to inform us of why Saudi Arabia is so averse to homosexuality today. Thank you.
Right, our next speaker will be Yu-Ying Hu. Yu-Ying is an assistant professor in the Graduate Institute of Gender Studies at Kaohsiung Medical University in Taiwan. Her research interests include transnational sexuality studies, ethnography, the dissemination and translation of human rights discourses in decolonized states, Chinese Tongzi and family, and the formation of queer identity, community, and culture in transnational Taiwan. And she is currently working on projects concerning the deployment of human rights discourse in Taiwanese transgender movement and the legal mobilization of same-sex marriage equality in contemporary Taiwan. And the title of your paper is Innocent Babies, Contagious Homosexuals, and Ambivalent Equality, Contested Discourses of Human Rights in the Same-Sex Marriage Movement in Taiwan.
Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be here and share with you my recent research project. And the topic I'm going to talk about today is, as you can see, it's about the contested discourses in public debates on the legalization of same-sex marriage in Taiwan. And this is actually part of my larger project. So today I'm going to focus about the discourse, the things that happen, the tropes and discourse emerging in the public debates of this recent LGBT advocacy. So, since 2009, public and political campaign for the legalization of same-sex marriage and civil partnership has unfolded to define the contour of the Tongzhi movement in contemporary Taiwan. The movement reached unprecedented progresses in the past year, which is 2016, especially when the amendments to the civil codes that guarantee equal rights of same-sex couples went through the first round of review in Legislative Yuan in Taiwan in December 2016. During the period, Tongzhi community and the Conservative Party opposing same-sex marriage were both provoked by the prospect of the final passing of the amendments. A media war was immediately followed as a result. 599 letters of opinions appeared in major Taiwanese newspapers from October 2016 to February 2017 this year. This is when Taiwan's Supreme Court announced their decision to explain whether the prohibition on same-sex marriage violates the Constitution. So because of this announcement, advocacies from both sides quiet down a little bit. By these 599 letters of opinions, both sides contest with each other about their views on same-sex marriage and communicate their political agenda to the majority of the society. On May 24, 2017, Taiwan Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage and specified that the Legislative Yuan needs to complete in 2 years the stipulation or the amendment of legal codes in order to allow same-sex couples to get married. Following this, another wave of media war was waged, debating on the legitimacy and consequences of the coming legalization of same-sex marriage. As McCann has argued, the change of law is not simply a matter of code stipulation or amendment conducted by legal elites or professionals only. Rather, it is a process of readjustment and recalibration of social values and attitudes. For the practice of law is always already embedded in the production and transformation in civil activities and in social ideologies. In other words, law is not an institution isolated from social reality, but rather transforming along with it. Moreover, McCann elaborated on the idea of legal mobilization, pointing out that in a social climate where people's consciousness of rights increases, the court in turn becomes a site where both common individuals and social activists can use litigation as a means to claim equal rights and social equality by setting a reasonable legal agenda. The legalization of same-sex marriage previously in the United States and currently in Taiwan demonstrates what legal mobilization can achieve, and hence becomes a critical object of study for researchers to understand how legal mobilization works in practice and theory. Ellen N. Anderson proposed a theoretical model of legal opportunity structure in her studies on the legalization of same-sex marriage in the United States. Among key factors, successful legal mobilization indicated by Anderson, framing that is to set legal agenda in tune with major trends of social values and opinions, is essential to open legal opportunities and lay the very important groundwork for legalization of same-sex marriage. Via the perspective of new institutionalism, Anderson further argues that the competition and negotiation between contrary legal and social actors and social political structures constitutes a context in which changes in law take shape and comes into being. Both McCann and Anderson's work point to an important influence legal mobilization has on LGBT or queer movement. When same-sex marriage equality becomes a dominant agenda in contemporary LGBT advocacy, and law is taken as a key resource, the strategy devised by the activists is no longer simply aimed to challenge and disrupt heteronormative social structure. On the contrary, to get into the heart of dominant social and cultural values and to align their political purposes along with them is a critical means for legal mobilizers to win public sympathy, to achieve favorable rulings in court, and therefore to be able to anticipate systematic changes both in law and in social attitude. Along the lines of these discussions, this paper is intended to examine how groups and individuals that either support or oppose same-sex marriage in Taiwan frame their political agenda publicly. This paper also aims to elucidate contested social ideologies and complex political climates that contextualize the framing in legal mobilization of same-sex marriage in contemporary Taiwan. So, this paper views the outburst in number of letters of opinions in major electronic and printed papers during the campaign for legalization of same-sex marriage as a significant manifestation of how both supporting and opposing parties attempt to frame their political agenda in alignment with dominant social values. By carefully analyzing the contents of these letters of opinions, I elucidate the tropes and discourses emerging in these public debates regarding the legitimacy of same-sex marriage and the social consequences brought by it. Among many themes emerging in these public debates, I particularly focus on how the rights and well-being of children are taken as the core of these public debates. The subject that stands out the most in these public debates through these hundreds of letters of opinions is, of course, how the legalization of same-sex marriage is going to affect the traditional structure of family. The opposing group persists in their negation of same-sex marriage as an unnatural family form, especially focused to confront the capability of same-sex couples to properly raise and educate children, which they see as the fundamental function of any family. In response, the supporting groups emphasize that reproduction is not the only thing that make family making meaningful. The fact that same-sex family is nothing but one of the multiple family forms such as single-parent or grandparent-headed families existing in contemporary societies challenges the privilege of monogamous heterosexual coupledom as the one and only legitimate environment where children can grow safe and sound. Along with the well-expected dispute over whether a normal and natural family exists, the focal point to this trend of debate is clearly the concern over reproduction, the well-being of children, and the definition of appropriate child rearing. Detailed contents and rhetoric in this debate elucidate the intriguing merging of notion of Christian principles and Chinese tradition, as well as ambivalent reification and subversion of heteronormative family norm. On the one hand, when the opposing groups stress that not only one man and one woman can provide suitable surroundings for children to flourish, they resort not only to Christian orthodoxy that condemns heterosexuality as sin, but also to the general and dubious concept of Chinese tradition. In particular, the opponents take issue with the prospect that the legalization of same-sex marriage will lead to confusion of Chinese kinship system and messed up children's gender recognition, since same-sex couple won't be able to fit in the highly gendered relative titles and king status. Insofar as the majority of opponents come from Christian backgrounds in one way or another, the reference to Chinese tradition and deliberate emphasis on potential sabotage of Chinese kinship structure shows a tendency to localize an anti-homosexuality discourse in Taiwanese social context. On the other hand, the supporting group denounced the view by asserting that love, rather than the gender or sexuality, is the key to successful family making. and child rearing. They reinforce this argument by highlighting how same-sex couples, especially those who already have children, are prone to stable and lasting relationships as much as heterosexual couples do, and members in their natal families provide welcome and support with little reservation. These discourses are attempted to strengthen social impression that same-sex couples are no different than heterosexual ones insofar as child born or adopted by same-sex family will be offered with abundant social resources. This image of devoted parent and loyal lifelong partners serves to assure the public that same-sex couples are sufficiently qualified to form a family and raise children. The alternative family form represented by same-sex couples, their children, and their natal families are undoubtedly innovative and disruptive in terms of heteronormative definition of family formation. Yet the fact that the exclusive intimacy and support from natal family are foregrounded as a qualifier of the legitimacy of same-sex family nonetheless shows the compromise of politics of marriage and family liberation with mainstream expectation of what counts as a fitting and functional family form. So as much as this argument, so just very briefly concluded my presentation today. These framing strategies demonstrate not only how diverse global and local values intersect with each other to form a social condition in which contested definitions of marriage, family, and equality emerge, but also demonstrate how child protection is held as a value hard to protest or deny, even in the face of scientific knowledge and discourses of human rights and legal equality. Even though the Supreme Court in Taiwan has just ruled in favor of same-sex marriage equality, how this obsession with innocent and vulnerable children will play to affect the amendments of legal codes awaits to be seen. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker will be Siodhbhra. Okay. Yes. So that will be Siodhbhra Margaret Parkin. Siodhbhra is a fellow at Yale Law School, Port Said China Center. I think it's Cincinnati. Did I pronounce it correctly? USA. Before she joined the center, she spent 3 years in Beijing working with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative, where she worked on a wide range of collaborative legal reform projects. Her primary areas of work experience and research interests include women's rights and LGBT rights. She holds an LLM from the Menen University of China Law School in Beijing. Siodhbhra completed a master's degree at Harvard University as well as the London School of Economics and Political Science. She received her bachelor's degree in history and East Asian studies at Harvard University. The title of her paper is Not Encouraging, Not Discouraging, and Not Promoting LGBTQ Legal Advocacy Efforts in China.
First of all, a tremendous thank you to the QueerAsia organizing team for making this presentation possible. I regret that I cannot join you in person. I am very pleased to be presenting after Yu-Ying, who I think gave a really great overview of how Taiwan is experiencing LGBT legal advocacy at a very interesting moment in their road towards access to justice. I'm going to be presenting on legal developments in the People's Republic of China. So I wanted to first give an overview of my presentation. I'll be providing a general background of the LGBT community in the PRC today, and then also discussing some of the background issues that I think will inform our discussion of how legal advocacy strategies are playing a role in ensuring that the rights and interests of LGBT people are being realized in mainland China. Second, I'll be going into an analysis of 3 different cases that have emerged in recent years that I feel demonstrate some very interesting trends in the strategic litigation route chosen by a lot of the LGBT community in China. And I'm hopeful that this will, in discussion, elucidate how legal advocacy is being performed in a country that has a very restrictive legal system overall and has to date not really been able to protect the rights and interests of many of its most vulnerable citizens. particularly LGBT. So without further ado, next slide, please. Just to give everyone a country overview, just the general status of LGBT people in mainland China in 2017. According to the latest available statistics, there are approximately 70 million people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or intersex in China today. However, when I say identify, I certainly do not mean openly identify. The social visibility of these groups remains very, very low. Only 15% are out to their families. To give a comparison, in the United States, that rate is about 55%, so very few, comparatively speaking. And only 5% are out in their workplaces, a very small number indeed, which demonstrates how being open about one's sexual orientation or gender identity is still very much a contested act in mainland China today. This is mostly the result of two main factors that I'm going to talk about briefly. First, the almost complete absence of any information about LGBT identity that is available to the average Chinese citizen as a result of censorship practices, as well as just a general lack of sex education and gender identity and gender diversity education in China. The average Chinese citizen will simply not have a very strong grasp of what LGBT is or means or does. At the same time, as Yu-Ying mentioned in her presentation, there's long-standing Chinese cultural preference for heterosexual marriage and reproduction. And individuals who choose to live outside of those normative family structures are choosing to fight literally with thousands of years of Chinese history and tradition. And it's going to be a very difficult thing, hence having so few people actually be open about their identity. As a result of these factors, over 50% of these LGBT individuals that participated in this mass survey reported that they experienced some form of discrimination in their daily lives, ranging from verbal abuse on the street, being fired at their job, to unfortunately suffering physical abuse and harm at the hands, normally of their, generally speaking, of their natal families, who tend to be the most prominent abusers of LGBT people in mainland China, and also from intimate partners, both heterosexual and homosexual. Next slide, please. So what does the law have to say about this, and how are people attempting to mobilize the law as a way of protecting their rights and interests? Well, very unfortunately, there is simply no law passed by a legislative body in the People's Republic that makes any mention of LGBT people or issues. This is, of course, a sword that cuts both ways. At the same time that there's no criminalization of same-sex behaviors or gender non-conforming behaviors, nor are there explicit protections for LGBT people. So while the criminal justice system is not mobilized to systematically persecute LGBT people, as might be the case in other jurisdictions, at the same time, when these people are experiencing discrimination, which they do, as we've just seen, they have no real legal recourse in terms of the statutes they can refer to try and get state protection and redress for the wrongs that they have suffered. In addition to that, on a people-to-people level, when LGBT people interact with agents of the state, it is really all over the board what kinds of attitudes they're going to have to encounter and manage. Legal actors that are embedded within the courts and the administrative agencies of government will have wildly different expectations of what being LGBT means, and therefore may practice very different responses to LGBT people when they come to them with some of their issues. Next slide, please. In terms of the concrete barriers that manifest as a result of these legal pressures, first of all, there is a restriction on a lot of LGBT-focused NGOs in China who are very frequently unable to continue to carry out their day-to-day operations and advocate for the rights of this community as a result of a registration system that considers LGBT issues to be too sensitive and does not permit them to carry out advocacy for the community. This becomes very important when we talk about legal advocacy because, as I'll discuss in just a second, civil society is crucial to realizing the rights of LGBT people. Secondly, there's a lack of LGBT affirmative health care and treatment, particularly with reference to mental health services. Individuals who do go to mental health counselors in China who admit to their same-sex attractions or their gender non-conforming identities will likely be subject to conversion therapy and other very harmful mental health practices that have adverse impacts upon them as well as their entire network. Further, the legal definition of gender discrimination in Chinese employment law, which is scattered across a few different laws, is quite limited. It does not, at the moment, include interpretations that would allow for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or alternative gender identity to be used as a legal basis for gender discrimination in, for example, an employment dispute. Finally, as I mentioned before, LGBT content in media and literature, even online, is subject to somewhat irregular government censorship efforts. resulting in that absence of information that I mentioned previously. But all these factors combined really mean that LGBT people in China are forced to live an invisible identity, where they are both part and not part of society at large at the same time. Next slide, please. Before I move into an analysis of the cases, I did just want to highlight the importance of LGBT civil society in mainland China today. The cases I'm about to discuss came about as the direct result of LGBT civil society, first of all, seeking out lawyers who might be sympathetic to LGBT issues and really training them on how they should deal with LGBT clients and what the most common legal problems were being faced within that community. In addition to training these lawyers on just, LGBT 101, if you will, these civil society members were also responsible for identifying plaintiffs in possible cases, which was not an easy task, as we've already seen. People who are willing to be open about their identities are extremely scarce. So finding and cultivating these individuals and supporting them both financially and psychologically through what are often long and drawn-out legal actions is not a very easy task. And civil society has been absolutely crucial as the go-between between the people demanding redress for wrongs, the lawyers who are trying to represent them, and interfacing with the state in the form of the courts and government agencies to try and realize justice for these groups. With that background being said, I'd like to move on to kind of an analysis of 3 separate cases. The first case I'm going to talk about was a case over conversion therapy that happened in 2014. Yenze Peng, who is pictured here, was a man who sought out mental health services in a clinic in Chongqing in China. He was subject to hypnosis and to electric shocks, and decided after this incident to sue both the clinic as well as Baidu, which is China's answer to Google, for promoting the services of this mental health clinic. Yenze was able to locate some lawyers through this robust civil society network willing to take on his case, and together, after many efforts, they were able to finally get a court to accept the case. Although first they had to scrub any mention of LGBT issues from the initial case application document, and were able to eventually have their day in court. Now, this case is usually treated as a classic example of what success looks like in the legal advocacy space in mainland China. Next slide, please. The major takeaways that resulted in the judgment of this case, first of all, in a very unexpected and welcome move, the judges writing the judgment affirmed in writing the depathologization of homosexuality. In 2001, the Chinese Psychiatric Association declared that homosexuality was not a legitimate mental illness diagnosis and should not be treated. However, most court cases up to this point never made reference to this fact, and it was only the result of Yenze and his legal team really claiming this in the course of the trial that the court recognized this and put this into writing. It also affirmed that the clinician at the clinic had violated the terms of his license in treating Yenze the way that he did, and gave some compensation to Yenze, very minor, but nevertheless something, which in a Chinese mainland court is a cause for celebration. And they also recommended, interestingly, that the clinician be investigated by administrative authorities for possibly committing what were likely criminal offenses. While this ultimately did not happen, the fact that the court even reached out to those administrative agencies is worthy of note. They also ordered that an apology be issued to the plaintiff, which is recognition that Yenze is, like every other Chinese citizen, to be protected and given equal rights as any other patient would be. The court also ordered that Baidu, once again China's answer to Google, stop advertising the services of conversion therapy centers. While this was not a legal injunction, Baidu very welcomely voluntarily chose to take action, which is another example of how these cases are having unexpected effects in terms of impacting private actor behaviors, even without legally ordering them to do so. This case was also used as an advocacy tool. It has been entered into evidence in other conversion therapy cases, and it has also been presented to the United Nations Committee Against Torture as part of the review of China's performance on the Convention Against Torture in 2016. This resulted in the first time the Chinese government going on record formally saying in an international legal forum that LGBT people were deserving of protections. Next slide, please. The next case we're going to be talking about is an employment discrimination case. The plaintiff in this case, Mr. C, is pictured here. Mr. C was fired after 8 days on the job at a firm in Guiyang City, where, according to a recording that he made of his coworker, he He was being let go because in his dress and mannerisms, he was performing in a masculine manner, whereas on the formal identity documents that he submitted when he initially entered the company, his gender marker was still his gender assigned at birth, that is female. However, in spite of having this reporting, when Mr. C decided to go to court, he went first to a labor arbitration committee. They first of all did not find for gender discrimination, which was Mr. C's main claim, while they did, however, affirm that Mr. C had been treated improperly by the company because he had not been given a valid labor contract and also had been underpaid. Mr. C, really what he wanted was vindication. He wanted an apology from the company and he wanted a finding of gender discrimination. So he opted with his legal team to lodge an appeal within the court in Weiyang City. And then also, and a very interesting sort of legal strategy, his lawyers decided to separate out some of the causes of action in this case and file a separate civil claim that his rights to dignity as a person had been infringed upon. That second case, the civil case, is still pending. The labor case, however, the appeal came down earlier this year, and in it, the court basically upheld the Labor Arbitration Committee's decision. That is, affirming that the company treated him improperly in the labor contract and had also been underpaying him, but refusing to issue a finding of gender discrimination and refusing to order the company to issue an apology. Next slide, please. This case is nevertheless very significant of our intention in a few different ways. First of all, just like Jens, Mr. C was treated as a normal, in some ways, plaintiff in this similar other type of case involved in a labor dispute, insofar as that the court did not treat him any differently, did not denigrate him in the decision, which is very significant. Sometimes what is not said in these judgments is every bit as significant as what is said. Furthermore, this case permitted the testimony of 2 expert witnesses, and this is the first time in China that an employment discrimination case involved expert testimony to talk about what the definition of gender discrimination is and how it applies to the LGBT and queer community. 2 different expert witnesses testified to 2 different judges in this case overall, and that is, first of all, very rare to happen procedurally, but secondly, allowed for the judges to interface directly with experts on the subject, which is a promising sign that in future there might be more engagement between the state and the legal teams of individuals going to court. It was also an important highlight placed on China's transgender community, which all too often is not given a lot of the attention that it, of course, deserves. Next slide, please. The final case I'm going to discuss very briefly is a case about homophobic content in textbooks in colleges in China. The plaintiff in this case, again pictured here, Siodhbhra, was reading a textbook in her psychology class in college that had content stating that homosexuality was abnormal, akin to pedophilia, and otherwise denigrated homosexuality. Now, once again, China depathologized homosexuality in 2001. So this was not scientifically accurate. The textbook in question was published in 2013. So Siodhbhra opted to first engage in a letter writing campaign. She wrote letters of complaint to the publisher, the library, the school, and the local Ministry of Education. When she did not get satisfactory responses, she chose to go to the Beijing center of the Ministry of Education and sue the government in an administrative lawsuit. She located a lawyer, again with the help of Chinese civil society groups, and while the administrative suit was overall a failure, there was some very interesting positive developments that occurred after the appeal was heard. Next slide, please. In the appeal decision, first of all, the court denied that Siodhbhra, the plaintiff, had legal standing to bring the case. They said that she was not uniquely or individually harmed, and therefore couldn't really be affected by the homophobic content in the textbooks in question. It also denied that the Ministry of Education had a legal duty to edit textbook content and ensure it was accurate. However, in a similar case, in a science textbook case, the opposite finding was actually held. So this was very clearly the result of the subject matter, that is, the reference to LGBT topics. In spite of this administrative legal failure, Siodhbhra and her lawyers ran a very successful media campaign, which widely advertised domestically and internationally the progress of her case and the nature of her complaint. In the end, a few months after the judgment was issued, one of the major publishing houses of mainland China issued a decision, a letter of apology to Siodhbhra, stating that they were sorry for the content that had existed and announced to her that they would be editing out future content denigrating to homosexuals in editions of the textbook. So again, a positive impact in spite of what was overwhelmingly a legal failure. Finally, just some final thoughts. Next slide, please. Looking forward, These are some images, and I'm sure they're not very clear on whatever screen you guys are reading from. These are images from a textbook that was recently approved by the Ministry of Education in China to be used in some elementary schools in Beijing. And this sex ed textbook actually has positive information on same-sex couples, and also explicitly states that the right of the individual to marry, not marry, love who they want to love, live who they want to live with, should be respected. This textbook is already in use in certain schools, not very many, but still it's a start, and might signal what might be a very long-term change in the way that the education system deals with LGBT issues in mainland China. I also wanted to highlight that decriminalization, the theme of this conference, is really only the beginning of a long road to access to justice. China had its first same-sex marriage case in 2016, which failed. Having heard Yu-Ying's very fascinating presentation, it will be very interesting to me to see what happens in the People's Republic of China, looking across the Taiwan Strait to the Republic of China, where this decision was just issued, and how that might impact the thinking of Chinese citizens on the mainland as they see that these other ways of allowing LGBT citizens to become equal and thriving members of society really only result in good things. So I am very hopeful that we will see positive developments in this space looking forward. Thank you all so much. Next slide, please. These are my contact details should anyone like to get in touch and talk more on these fascinating subjects. Thanks to my co-panelists, Ismail, Yu-Ying, Ella, and Rajorshi. You guys are doing an excellent job, and I'm really enjoying the presentation so far. Thank you.
Thank you, Shifra. Our last but not least speaker will be Ella Parry-Davies, who is affiliated with King's College London and the National University of Singapore. Ella is a doctoral researcher in performance studies at King's College London and the National University of Singapore. She has published in performance research and performance philosophy and is a co-editor of Contemporary Theatre Review's Interventions platform. She convened Beirut Bodies in Public, a workshop on performance and public space in Beirut, and is co-founder of the Asia-Europe Research Collective After Performance. She was also a recipient of the Dwight Conquergood Award at PSI, #22.
PSI 22, okay. Thank you so much to be here, and thank you to the organisers of this excellent event. How is the post-lunch energy? Okay? All right, cool. My paper looks at the case of the Singaporean teenage blogger Amos Pangsang, and specifically at the gendered character of the terms on which he was criminalised following a video blog excoriating former Singaporean Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, who passed away in March 2015. I argue that examining this case reveals the ways in which gender norms produce performances of deviation as a way of consolidating normative citizenship on the state's terms. So the paper comes out of an extended project of mine on performative memorial practices in Singapore and the Lebanese capital, Beirut. So in this sense, I'm constructing Asia as a continent that potentially includes West Asia. This is a deliberate regionalization that strategically imagines a shared, though radically homogeneous identification, a way of extending Kaohsiung Chen's notion of Asia as method towards what is more commonly called the Middle East. Today, I'd like to use Lebanese scholarship on queer citizenship to illuminate related questions in the Singaporean context. So although I'm not going to have time to go extensively into the Lebanese context, I'm particularly interested in approaches developed by Maya Mikdashi. Mikdashi focuses on the ways in which governmentality and biopower produce each citizen, as well as groups of citizens, as a particular derivation from the norm. In other words, then, it's through deviancy that the norm is produced. In looking towards manifestations of queer citizenship that expose and denaturalize the abstract norms upon which this relies, Mikdashi opens up the possibility of a queer method for critical citizenship analysis. Can you hear me okay? A key potential of her approach, to my mind, is to defamiliarize a scholarly archive dominated by analyses of sectarianism, suggesting that rather than a deterministic fact of Lebanese politics, sect is also a divisive economic strategy that sustains the dominance of an elite class. So again, kind of drawing on the vocabulary that was used this morning, queer here exists as a verb that intersects with rather than kind of defines identity categories or formations. In the Singaporean context, Mikdashi's method helps to illuminate ways in which gender normativities undergird state modes of discipline ostensibly predicated on the threat of ethnic and religious disharmony. Whilst the term race and the naturalized categorization of racial identities dominates state discourse in Singapore and, to an extent, the academic archive, analysing instances of gendered deviation reveals the unnaturalness and incoherence of various configurations of normative citizenship. A further advantage of Kwon Sing-chen's Asia's method is that it debunks the Orientalist notion of the Occidental or Western scholar as neutral, while the rest is marked as other. So, in my view, it's not enough just to acknowledge the positionality of the researcher. This must be made foundational and conceptually generative in the analysis. So, one of the consequences of my own relation to a history of British colonialism in Singapore, as a British educated UK citizen, is that it's made me especially cautious of the tendency to rescue Amos as a figure whose particular brand of activism and advocacy for free speech is legible to a post- or neo-imperial North Atlantic British political ideal. Mindful of this, it should be clear, however, that I'm not so much concerned with assessing the legitimacy of Yi's argument or recuperating him as an activist figure, as I am with exploring what gender discourses are doing in this specific instance of Singaporean post-colonial historiography. So,
Lee Kuan Yew is dead, finally. Why hasn't anyone said, fuck yeah, the guy is dead? Lee Kuan Yew was a horrible person. Because everyone is scared. Everyone is afraid that if they say something like that, they might get into trouble, which, give Lee Kuan Yew credit, that was primarily the impact of his legacy.
During the official week of mourning that followed Lee Kuan Yew's death in March 2015, Amos uploaded the 8-minute video, Lee Kuan Yew is finally dead, a diatribe against the former Prime Minister and what he saw as Lee's misleading claims to democratic government and his prioritising of financial profit over public well-being. The video ends on the hope that Singapore can now become a happier place in Lee's absence. Amos makes a very brief comparison between Lee Kuan Yew and Jesus Christ, and also uploaded this image. Can we go back to the... How do we go back to the... Here we go. This image of Lee Kuan Yew, in his own words, butt-fucking Margaret Thatcher. Amos was reported to the police by over 20 complainants, including his mother, and was... didn't expect that to get the laugh, and was subsequently detained for over 50 days. He was eventually convicted on grounds of the religious reference that he made and the obscene image, though the charge relating to his offensive critique of Lee Kuan Yew was in fact dropped. He's recently been granted political asylum in the US, although I think it's worth stating that he spent a lot more time in detention there, awaiting that, than he ever did in Singapore. At the time of his first arrest, he was 15 years old. I'm going to turn now to the contextual gender discourses against which these events occurred before returning attention to Amos himself. The island city-state of Singapore achieved self-governance from the British in 1959, following which Lee Kuan Yew, leader of the People's Action Party, or PAP, was elected Prime Minister. He advocated for merger with the Federation of Malaysia, which took place in 1963, but fell apart just 2 years later, making Singapore for the first time a fully independent nation-state. Lee Kuan Yew's tearful breakdown when announcing the separation from Malaysia in a press conference in 1965 is a scene with ongoing predominance as the inaugural performative of a post-independence nationhood. The scene performs a resilient discourse in which Singapore is in perpetual and highly self-conscious crisis or emergency. The threat of external military aggression and internal ethnic disharmony is continually emphasized by the state, rationalizing an array of stringent government practices and lawmaking organized around the total defense policy, which includes social and psychological defense principles. The way that Lee Kuan Yew tells the story of separation in his own terms is strikingly gendered. In his memoirs, The Singapore Story, he recounts, "Under Malay Muslim custom, a husband, but not the wife, can declare talaq, I divorce thee, and the woman is divorced. Malaysia divorced Singapore. The partners, predominantly Malay in Malaya, predominantly Chinese in Singapore, had not been compatible." This passage is paradigmatic of the ways in which Singapore is personified as feminine and in need of fatherhood or husbandry, so i.e. in the post-independence era by the PAP and Lee Kuan Yew as the nation's founding father. At the same time, the gendering of the social body becomes normalized against, or perhaps eclipsed by, the perpetual crisis of multiracialism. In 1998, Indonesian President Bacharuddin Yusuf Habibie apparently did not say, "There are 211 million people in Indonesia. All the green area is Indonesia, and that little red dot is Singapore." Though Habibie denied it, and notwithstanding its dubious origin, the little red dot and the threat of aggression that it implies stuck. In queer theatre scholar Ray Langenbach's words, there is, quote, "something sexual and fascinating about this tiny, hot, red G-spot, visible against a cool green ground, something which makes those green seas recede into the background, while the dot persists, foregrounded, burned into the retina." The metaphor perfectly fitted the PAP's narrative of Singaporean crisis and exceptionalism in a gendered idiom. Against this gendered narrative of national vulnerability, Singaporean masculinities are shaped by compulsory military service at 18 and by the expectation of reproductive nuclear family models. Sexual relations between men are criminalised by the 377A clause, actively retained from the British rule, and a discourse in which homosexuality is perceived pathologically to infect the social body, as in this example, remains prominent. When celebrations of LGBTQI+ rights occur, these are frequently conducted on the state's terms, as we can see from the annual Pink Dot event, which literally pinkwashes the problematic gendered implications of the red dot narrative. So needless to say, though it may be clearly meaningful and life-sustaining for LGBTQ+ communities in Singapore, Pink Dot, like the designation of the park where it takes place as Speaker's Corner, could conversely be seen as an example of homo-nationalism or gendered politics, which accommodates, indeed recuperates otherness when it's useful to extending and securing ideological hegemony. At the very least, I think we can ask the question, who gets to decide the terms of inclusion and visibility here? So whilst I'm certainly not making a claim about Amos's sexual orientation, I'm interested in the ways that, against the context I've just described, homophobic and misogynist discourses were used to pathologize and silence him. Members of his family have spoken to the press on several occasions, with his mother declaring him to be out of her control, and his grandmother recounting that he was a normal child until he got hooked on the internet. Ye's participation in mandatory psychiatric treatment on the suggestion of autism spectrum disorder was used as leverage in lessening his bail conditions, though these were not granted as he refused to attend after the first 2 sessions. A letter from his lawyer described conditions in which he was strapped to an adult psychiatric ward bed for 36 hours against his will, while denied toilet facilities and prohibited from having access to books, leading to suicidal thoughts. There are several, in fact, this I would give you a notification because this next slide contains violent homophobic views. There are several comments on re-uploads of his videos that make derogatory statements relating to his sexuality and gender performance. I will leave you to... Further, given the fact that public outrage clearly focused on his treatment of Lee Kuan Yew, when he was finally sentenced, the court judgment gave seemingly disproportionate weight to the Margaret Thatcher slide. We'll skip that. With the judge noting, our current societal norms are clearly against sexual experimentation by our young. It has to be emphasized that this image is of unnatural intercourse. Such an image would not only tend to excite teenagers to try out different sexual positions, but also deviant sexual activity, i.e. anal intercourse. Such desires and lascivious thoughts would have a corrupting effect on young minds. Surpassing the image of Thatcher and Lee, I believe this judgment and the discourses surrounding it are indicative of a broader anxiety around a young generation of Singaporeans who were not around during early years of post-colonial nation building and upon whom the narrative of crisis therefore exerts less force. Even if the erotic potency of the image is, I would say, negligible, the discourse and metaphors of sexual corruption and deviancy are leveraged to infantilize and criminalize Yi. So using these tropes, he's portrayed as an internal infection needing to be disciplined and corrected by the patriarchal nation state. Amos Yi's case, I would argue, sustains the argument that normative citizenship is paradoxically produced through performances of deviancy, in which gender is a crucible of discipline, but also potentially of defamiliarization, denaturalization, and challenge. Thank you.
Right, do we have our volunteers? Thank you. So I think we can invite our panelists to... Right, so we'll finish at 3:30. Well, very tight on time, so should we take a question? The first question or a question? Yes, the gentleman.
Just a very quick comment. My name is Tsuhan. I'm from Singapore. I'm a visual artist. So naturally, I'm responding to Ella and also Ismail's. I just noted a very interesting connection because Ella was using Middle East queer theory in a way to highlight this word called deviance or deviation. And I'm just very curious about the choice on Ismail's part to have the word deviance instead of the word deviation or derivation from the norm. And the peculiar choice that you have, and very particular choice of this term deviance, which you repeated.
Sorry, between deviance and what other terms?
Deviation or derivation.
Well, I chose deviance because, firstly, I think it is, even though your examples drew from Lebanon, I think comparing Lebanon with Saudi Arabia is really, really a stretch just because of the way how politics operates in Saudi Arabia, the way the kingdom is towards LGBT issues vis-a-vis Lebanon. So trying to draw a comparison between Saudi Arabia and Singapore, which in some articles in Singapore media have actually done, is absolutely quite ridiculous in my opinion. The choice as to why I chose deviance was because I felt that in Saudi Arabia, because of the context of how everything was so suppressed, even the slightest bit of not adhering to the certain law, even when operating within private domains, becomes a form of deviance because it just goes against the whole legitimacy campaign of the kingdom itself. So that was why I chose deviance. As to why I chose deviance specifically as a lexicon, I don't think I had a particular reason, because I think if it was between deviance or deviancy, it would have been the same for myself. I don't know about for you, but.
Can you hear me? Okay. No. Okay. I think it's the.
Just push the.
No, this is just for recording. Yeah. Mikdashi, I think, uses the term a derivation from the norm, and I think what I would just add, I guess, or kind of respond to what you're saying, is that I think a kind of comparison in the strictest sense of that term between Singapore and Lebanon would also be tenuous and kind of misleading. I mean, it would make certain things visible and a wide swathe of things very difficult to see, right? I think kind of creating this kind of strategic imaginary of Asia as a method, which eventually I think, you know, is something that is, like queer, maybe something transient or something that we need to put a lot of pressure on, but is nevertheless an interesting point of departure, I think, for the project, at least, that I'm doing, is to look at ways in which issues around gender or queer performance or sexuality raise related questions in both of those places. So there's no kind of comparison directly. I'm not aiming to apply the Lebanese context or scholarship thereof to Singapore, but really to kind of look at what tensions and kind of affinities and frictions lie between those things in terms of the method of thinking that we kind of engage in when reading, when addressing these topics. Is that clear? Okay.
We have time for one more question. Yeah. Do we have a microphone? Yes, please. The lady in the back. Last seat. Last row.
My name is Eva. I'm from King's College London. I have a question for Yu-Ying on the case of Taiwan. Thank you very much for your presentation, very informative. You mentioned that the Confucian family values, like selectively, is mobilized by the fundamentalist Christian in Taiwan. But I'm also wondering about the role of the state, the Taiwanese state, in these media war and in the whole process of legalizing same-sex marriage, because it seems that, reading from news, that the state is very ambivalent at this moment. And also, can you speak more about the role of the state and also the two major political parties in shaping or not doing anything in this process? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Yes. Yes, I've been asking about why Taiwan can be the first country in Asia that legalized same-sex marriage, and I believe that the role of state, especially the current administration, is proud of being more liberal and democratic in contrast to KMT. I don't know if you are familiar with Taiwanese history, especially against China. And the current administration is I'm not sure whether they are still pro-independence right now, but before the election they are more pro-independence, and they want to, I believe that the group that advocates same-sex marriage particularly choose this political moment to start their campaign because they know this government will be more supportive of this same-sex marriage advocacy. And of course, the government right now seems more, the state now seems more ambivalent. And I won't use the word ambivalent. They are just passive. They gave, they succeeded they opened the platform for the society to debate, so that they can claim that, okay, this is social consensus. We just follow what the majority of the society want us to do. So this is why this media war is waged. So that both parties are very eager to persuade the majority of society that their views are correct. Is it repeating what I'm saying? Yeah, and in another vein, like I think the ambivalent status of Taiwan as a nation state, like less than sovereign nation state, it has a very important role to play in this whole successful legal mobilization. I lost my train of thought.
So sorry.
Anyway, like when the Supreme Court ruled in favor of same-sex marriage, there is abundance of news comments and news reports and the letters of opinion saying that, like, you see the embrace of human rights and equal citizenship is a better means for Taiwan to promote its international reputation than like any other effort to build a foreign alliance or to join the international political organization, things like that. So the passing of same-sex marriage has definitely a positive effect on the government's effort to build an internationally recognized, independent, and democratic nation state. Yeah. So thank you.
Well, thank you for our lovely audience. May I please tell you, if you have more questions for our panelists, clearly we ran out of time today, please do let us know, and we can always put you in contact with them. So maybe one last applause for each of Siodhbhra, Rajorshi, Ella, Yu-Ying, and